And has it shown up yet? Well, according to my Hangout, we are now live. Hello and welcome to live broadcasting at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be discussing the question, is Donald Trump's destruction of U.S. power a good thing? And today I am lucky enough to be joined by Jon from Safe for Democracy, one of my favorite podcasts, to discuss this issue. And you'll also notice that we are, as we are the rare occasion that both Jon and I are in the United States. So it's not just going to be disembodied voices this time. You will see our magnificent faces, such as they are. We're going to get into it. We've got a live chat going. Would like to say, please keep things kind of decent on the live chat. You can swear, you can rip into each other a bit, but if someone's up there just being negative and disruptive, I will block you. So don't do that. Jon, you want to say hi?
Hi. Yeah, I'm Jon Coumes. I run the podcast Safe for Democracy. We talk about the failures of U.S. foreign policy. We just got done with series on Iran, which went on for a really long time. And we're going to have a much longer series on Vietnam, which is going to start right after December. And I'm connected to this chat on a Metro PCS SIM card through my ancient phone's hotspot. So hopefully it's all going to work out pretty good. But Rob's going to let me know if I start to look or sound choppy, and we'll figure it out from there.
And also let us know on the live chat if we've stopped making sense or stopped looking like people. And we can just cut out the video, and that should make everything function a little bit better. I'm noticing a bit of a delay, but I don't think that should matter too much. So today we're going to discuss something that I've been thinking about for a while. The question is, and we're formulating it as a question is Donald Trump's destruction of U.S. power a good thing? And before we get into that, we've also got to demonstrate. I know that I've got a lot of people who don't believe that Donald Trump is a bad thing for U.S. power. So I think we've got to address, Jon and I have got to lay out why, in fact, we think that Donald Trump is destroying U.S. power. And then we'll talk about whether or not that's a good thing. I guess to start off, we should make clear how we feel about Donald Trump's approach to U.S. power. And I think a good way to start with that is to bring up something that we discussed last time Jon and I talked, when we discussed what's happening to the State Department right now, what's happening to sort of the U.S.'s formal diplomatic structure, like how it's sort of really being destroyed. And it's the distinction, the crucial distinction is between the stuff we hear about, the stuff we read about in the newspapers all the time, stuff like the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, issues like that, and everything else that the United States government does through the State Department, through other institutions. The United States is present in every country in the world, and every country in the world is obligated to have a policy or an approach to the United States. We'll get into the weeds a bit on what Donald Trump's influence looks like in the more telegenic, well-known disaster places. But I think it's also important to focus, to realize that it goes way beyond that type focus. And to really talk about Trump's effect on U.S. power, we can't just talk about those few sort of sacrificed countries that are being destroyed by U.S. military might or conflicts that the United States has created. It goes far, far beyond that. You want to weigh in, Jon?
Yeah, well, sorry, I got to turn my phone's vibrator off. Yeah, sorry. I've been having kind of a slow morning. Definitely, we're going to have to get into stuff we talked about in the last show on Tillerson. And I think we might even be able to mention the fact that Tillerson's probably on his way out because he desperately wants to be out and because Trump
This is Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
Yeah. And they were going to replace him supposedly with the head of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, who's even more into this Steve Bannon-esque clash of civilizations, war between Western Christendom and Muslim kind of thing. So,
yeah,
I can only see that going in a bad direction. But the other thing I want to touch on, and that we'll eventually get to, is in as much as I think Rob and I are probably going to agree that the Trump administration has managed to diminish U.S. power in a diplomatic sense, it hasn't, and it intentionally has not, in the sense of the military or the power to harm.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. But sorry, did I cut you off? Did you have a thought to finish?
No. Go for it.
I think that's a very important point, but I think that also gets to the distinction that I'm trying to make. It's like, yes, we have a tremendously powerful military instrument. And yes, Donald Trump and his affinity for generals has involved that being pushed to the fore more forcefully. I saw a clip today that we now apparently have boots on the ground in Yemen, which is just shocking to me. I know we'd always been doing special forces stuff there, but if you look, it's in every single Mideast country. Not every, well, I don't want to overstate things, but in most of the places in the Middle East where the United States has an interest, Donald Trump and his generals have jacked up the U.S. military presence there. I think that's insane, and I think if you take a very limited approach to U.S. power and U.S. prestige, it's like, yeah, like sort of this sort of like U.S. as bully thing, then yeah, I guess in a very limited sense, you could say that Trump has increased U.S. power, but the fact that we can blow things up good is nowhere near as important to U.S. power and prestige as the United States' position in the world broadly. And yes, that physical force is a big part of that, but it is by no means all of it. You've got, I don't know, you can't put something like this in percentages, but it's, 3-part U.S. power and prestige, as I see it, is maybe 1 or 2 parts that physical military power, and about 8 parts the fact that the rest of the world, while they may not trust us, they may not like us, they're kind of like willing to just sort of get along in the system that the United States has created. And it's that diminishing that I think is horrifying and is a real problem for the United States. We're not capable, and to put it in a really basic way, we're not capable of exerting ourselves militarily in more than 4 or 5 countries. I mean, we're doing stuff in dozens of countries at this point. But if it gets to the point where we don't just have 1 or 2 states that disagree with us and actively oppose us, and it gets to the point where we've got dozens of states actively opposing us, then we're screwed. We're already in an absurd debt situation. We're already spending an extraordinary amount of money to deal basically mostly with like guys in caves. And the idea that we can just have a strong military, and continue to have real influence and power in the world is a joke. That's just simply not true.
Yeah, and it's one of those lessons that you would have thought we'd have learned in the Philippines at the turn of the last century. A lesson that if we didn't learn it in the Philippines, you would have thought we would have learned it in Vietnam. And if we didn't learn it in Vietnam, then we would have learned it in Afghanistan. But it seems like a lesson that we're apparently destined to teach ourselves it over and over and over for the rest of U.S. history. But anyway, I think what we ought to get into is the ways in which we actually think the Trump administration, what it's been doing, the way they act, has been, and how it has been diminishing U.S. power abroad. You can get us started off there.
What was that? Sorry, I was dealing with.
We got to get rid of Barry White. Why do we attract so many anti-Semites? I don't know what's up with that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're not as uncritically supportive as Israel is 95% of other U.S. media. So I don't know. All right, Barry White. I think thank you. We've established that Barry White does not like Israel or the Jews, which is a perfectly fine opinion to have in our comment stream, but if you're going to continue to shout it at the top of your lungs and let nobody else talk about it, you will be blocked. So, all right, I'll give Barry one last chance. If he doesn't comment any further, he's fine. But if he does that again, he's blocked. All right. Sorry, you had asked me a question. I was dealing with the live chat.
Yeah, I think we just ought to kick off with how we think the U.S. is diminishing in its diplomatic power abroad. How the Trump administration is doing it.
Absolutely. Well, I think we covered with our last conversation, with the conversation on the State Department, that maybe I'll link in the comments or something. Like, we established sort of the process issues. The State Department, which is where diplomacy is done for the United States, not just like, and once again, focusing on, where are we at? 107? No, we're 200 odd countries in the world right now. And the State Department is the bureaucracy that deals with that. The Trump administration and his guy who was chosen to lead the State Department, Rex Tillerson, have chosen to really just brutalize the institution. People are leaving left and right. They're implementing a 30% budget cut. It's a mess. They've essentially destroyed our main. They haven't destroyed. I mean, it still exists, but our main tool of diplomacy has been cut down. And I think we've got a 2-hour conversation covering that. What I think is more interesting is, to me today, is looking at the way that Donald Trump's public persona and public approach to things is just tremendously damaging. And I think maybe I should be a little clearer about sort of how I see the world and how I see a number of issues related to multilateral institutions. When I was a kid, when I was in my 20s, early 20s, I was sort of more supportive of the sort of traditional sort of conservative, I'll put quotes on it. I believe I'm the only real conservative. The sort of standpoint or position that you'll read in a lot of conservative media towards international institutions. Like, oh, why is the UN being mean to Israel? Or why is this not doing what we want it to do? Blah, 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 blah. And I used to be really like sympathetic to that idea because I didn't know much, because I hadn't read much history and I didn't know much about the institutions in question. And having looked at these institutions, things like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and sort of how they came to be, I came to a slightly more adult realization that these are U.S. institutions. They are controlled by the United States. They were created by the United States, and their charters were written by the United States. And I think I am a fan of these institutions because I think there's a potential there that they could grow into more democratic things. But I also acknowledge that a lot of those more democratic elements, like the General Assembly and the United Nations, is sort of a fig leaf, sort of a like, okay, let's give people a way to express resentment against us so they continue to participate in this institution that functions, our institution of control. And it's fascinating to watch people in the Trump organization, the Trump administration, more or less the same thing at this point, adopt this like really infantile, like, why is UN mean to Israel approach, not as a way to curry favor, not as a way to pick up votes, but as part of their public diplomacy, as part of their position when they are speaking for the United States. And it's just insane to me. Today, in fact, there's a resolution in the General Assembly, the quasi-democratic element of the United Nations, going forward. There's a vote going forward today, and both Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, Nikki Haley is our ambassador to the United Nations, have consciously threatened that, like, if the vote doesn't go our way, we might take back some aid because you're not showing us the proper respect. I mean, it is, oh God, it's just idiotic, is what it is, and it is absolutely.
So Nikki Haley, supposedly one of the diplomatic adults in the room,
yeah,
used the literal phrase, were taking names, referring to the countries which receive aid from the United States and who aren't willing to support our unilateral move to put our embassy in Jerusalem.
It's just, and it's kind of self-fulfilling, because it's these guys assuming that they're speaking from a position of weakness, which is simply not true, but it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, you've got these institutions that are still largely run for our benefit. I think my sort of experience as a lawyer plays into this, is that before I started sort of working in and around sort of international business and seeing how that worked, it was easier for me to have this idea that the U.S. is somehow an underdog or put upon or taken advantage of with some of these institutions and international approaches. And I'm here to tell you, having looked at this stuff for a couple of years in great detail, that couldn't be further than the truth. Things like the World Trade Organization, things like the United Nations, that stuff, though actually the WTO specifically is developing slightly more democratic, for lack of a better term, aspects, more buy-in and benefits for other countries in the world. I mean, these things are there to preserve and protect U.S. power. And it is insane to me to just see these folks act like weak thugs. I mean, that's what a bully is, essentially, is a weakling. And the idea that the United States needs to do this at this point is just, I mean, it would never be a good policy and a good approach for the United States to take. But just to see it now is just mind-blowing. Yeah.
And to drill down, or to expand a little bit, I guess, on what you were saying. So like Rob just said, we live in a world governed at least in part by multilateral institutions. And that's not just stuff like the UN or the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank. It's also stuff like the Non-Proliferation Treaty and all the other treaties that govern sort of world behavior, right? And in as much as none of those international institutions are perfect, like Rob said, the U.S. had the largest hand in forming them, and thereby still the largest hand in controlling them.
Yeah.
And without getting into the morality or quality of the results that those institutions have generated, and especially talking about the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO, I think I might have different opinions than Rob. But without getting into any of that,
you're not a big fan of the Washington Consensus, are you, Jen?
No. Oh my God, no. But those structures, what they've done is allowed the U.S. to control basically the world zeitgeist for 60 years 70 years at extremely low cost.
Yes.
That is that, if you look at the ways that one country can make another country do something, right? It's diplomacy, and that could be any number of things, from the institutions we're talking about to economic pressures to whatever. And then military force. And one of those is always, always, always much cheaper.
Yeah.
Much more efficient.
Yeah.
And if the U.S. had tried at the barrel of a gun to convince every other country in the world that low trade barriers and free marketeerism was the way to go, man, that would have been an expensive proposition. And like I said, I'm not endorsing the results, but our complex of multilateral institutions got that done.
Yeah.
And got it done at low cost.
Yeah, at almost no cost. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm looking a lot at the British Empire right now, and they had to go and enforce free trade with gunboats and whatnot, and that was expensive, and it eventually sort of killed them through overstretch. And the fact that these institutions, I mean, and there's so many of these structures that people. Like in the State Department, I can't remember the exact details of this, but there was some kerfluffle, it was in the news this week, around human rights, around Tillerson and certainly Trump didn't feel like human rights should be as much of a priority anymore for these institutions, because they're going to be tough and focus on real politics. And it's just like, it's fascinating to me, because it's like these fucking clowns don't realize that human rights has been a tremendous club in the U.S. arsenal for decades. It's just a clown show, as if human rights was a concept that was ever used by the United States for anything other than our benefit. It's the Trump administration is it's sort of government by people who don't understand how anything works, and it's tremendously frustrating to look at. And I think that the instant counter to that is, well, yeah, but no, this is tough and honest and and it's like, what about diplomacy and about the way the world works do you think is tough, is honest, or rewards toughness? Very little of it. Very little of it. And to the extent that there's more of that, the world becomes a more dangerous place. And a more dangerous, more unstable place is always worse for the guy on top. And that's us at this moment. So
yeah. And yeah, take a look at that chat, because I think we have some stuff we might want to talk about there. But human rights is a really interesting point, because like Rob said, it's always been used as a cudgel with which to bludgeon other countries into submission. So
yeah, it's a tremendously useful tool of statecraft.
You look at different times in the past when the U.S. has tried to extract concessions from, say, Cuba or Iran or any of the other traditional bugbears. The thing that we always go to are those Amnesty International reports on what's going on in those countries. And what's interesting is we've been able to do that despite massive human rights violations by our military and within our own borders, right? You know, it takes a lot. I mean, really takes a lot to kind of pull back the veil and kind of get us off our high horse or get us off of the moral high ground. Never had it. We've always been able to act as though we did. And Donald Trump is somehow finally managing to blow that away.
To blow away the pretense that the United States is a good actor.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you for articulating.
No, and I think that's very key. If you assume that the United States is always good and always in the right, then maybe Trump is somehow a good thing. I don't understand, but that's not the case. We've always been excellent at using institutions, at using concepts like human rights to look like we're always in the right. And it's people do not understand how important looking like you're in the right is, because it's not military force that is going to keep Europe, more or less playing along with our trade policy. It's not military force that's going to keep China as a paid up member of the international system. It's the idea that, like, okay, these guys, they seem okay. And it's better than the alternative of anarchy. And by taking this like, tough approach, this is thrown away. This is discarded. And that's the tremendous, tremendous danger of what the Trump administration is up to.
Yeah. So do we want to?
It's fascinating. Do we want to look at this live chat? Were you talking about Robert Brown, who says this is a great example of the idiocy of this approach? It says, what is it? As Trump thumps the ball out of the park again, and you guys look more and more stupid. Do Muslims apologize for the Yazidi sex slaves, the girl captive brides in Nigeria? You guys are weak. And I'm like, what does this guy even think? What does this guy even think we're talking about? It's mystifying to me that someone can think they're talking about politics and foreign policy in a meaningful way and take that approach. I guess what that is once again, like, just looking at what we hear about in CNN or Fox News or the New York Times, just looking very closely at policy in the Middle East, which is a sideshow. I don't understand. I guess that's not very clear. I guess the ball is hidden very carefully. That, like, what goes on in the Middle East might have had some broader geopolitical significance 25, 30 years ago, when Saudi Arabia owned the oil markets. But that's simply no longer the case. We are devoting more and more, and especially under Trump, more and more of our self-respect and ideas of valor and glory to this progressively less and less useful section of the world. I don't know. Sorry, I'm just rambling.
Yeah, and I don't know. It seems like Mr. Robert Brown has sort of a, I don't know what it is about the internet, man.
Yeah. This is actually a good preview. I'm going to end the holiday season talking about some of the comments that I get about Muslim, maybe it's because Muslims have slaughtered 273 million people. Why would you apologize to followers of I'm not going to finish that, but so I'm going to be covering that a little bit, this myth of the special evil of Muslim history in videos coming up in the next couple of weeks. I love that it's really specific figure, that 273 million people. It's not. It's amazing that they can somehow, we can't get good numbers for body counts from Syria over the past 5 years, but this guy has come up with exactly 273 million people for the past 1,500 years of Islamic history, and actually that's almost certainly mostly based on a figure for the Muslim conquests of India that assumes that there were like assumes that there were like 600 million Indians 2,000 years ago, which simply isn't true. But anyway, sorry, I digress again.
No problem. And I don't know. Eventually, we'll be able to pull something out of this chat. Shout out to Bruno, by the way, one of my biggest fans, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but I think it might be worth talking about for a minute the ways. Specific ways in which we think Trump is diminishing this very specific kind of power, this moral authority. And I mean, I think the first and most constant way has been that, even if Fox and Trump's base in the United States don't see his statements as xenophobic, he knows a ton of black people, he's got a ton of black friends, he's got a ton of Jewish friends or whatever. That's not convincing anybody else in the Western world.
Yeah.
And in as much as it's become like the normal thing here in the United States, having a bumbling, senile racist in the White House and constantly on television all around the world, that's enough. That's enough to diminish the moral authority that allows the United States. Again, I'm not going to make a statement here about whether or not it's a good thing. Allows the United States to get other countries to come along, on whatever the particular project is.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, people really didn't like George Bush because he had sort of a Texas approach that was more powerful in the United States. But I mean, take any sort of knee-jerk reaction that people in Europe or the broader world took to George W. Bush and amplify that by 1,000. I mean, you just watching the guy talk, it's clear that there's just not much going on up here, and also that he's not too partial to people of color, unless they're athletes that stand for the national anthem. His approach to, I think, women and people of color is, I think, something that resonates a lot with most of his older white voting base, is that, of course, I'm not a racist. How could I? I don't have anything against these people as long as they do what they're supposed to do and know their place, which is, for folks who were born after the, 1960 or so, is almost the definition of racism, to believe that people of certain classes and ethnicities are valuable to the extent that they know their place. So yes, that's a very good point. That just Trump himself is tremendously damaging. You still there, John?
Yeah, I'm still around.
All right.
We're not losing.
We're working our way down a list of things that.
No, just whatever strikes you as the stuff that's. I mean, I've got a couple things here. First and foremost is just Because in as much as through gutting the State Department and in his own total ability to run an executive, Donald Trump hasn't actually managed to do a whole lot of stuff except for the transfer of the embassy. Well, the planned or announced transfer of the embassy. But so statements and the way he acts are one of the ways in which he diminishes U.S. Moral authority.
Absolutely.
And I think the other big one is sort of insanity. So this might not be something that everybody knows, but feigned insanity at the top actually has kind of a pedigree in international relations, in that Nixon and Kissinger during the Cold War were convinced, and I think they like had a pretty good point, that if they could insinuate to the Russians or make the Russians believe that Nixon was unstable, that he was capable of anything.
It was the madman strategy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That their brinksmanship would be all the more effective because the Russians would believe the threats because they believed Nixon capable of anything, right? And a couple of members of the Trump administration have made noises about that same thing, that Trump's somehow engaging in the same kind of politics. But the thing about the Nixon-Kissinger thing is, Nixon was like maybe evil, but he was really smart. And yes. Kissinger was maybe one of the smartest guys of the last century. Donald Trump is an idiot, and he hired only other idiots to work in his White House.
Well, and also, sorry.
Right. And the other thing is, the Nixon-Kissinger thing worked because they were looking at one adversary that they knew that was going to be analyzing everything they were going to do. And they did it with a plan, to influence certain pieces on the board and to move them in certain ways. Donald Trump acting insane, just, I don't know, for the world, no, that's not part of a cohesive, coherent diplomatic strategy,
And I think that's exactly what I was going to say. That's a really key point. Sort of Nixon and Kissinger portraying themselves as madmen in the context of this dual superpower relationship, and where sort of most of the world was organized in a sort of binary fashion. Okay, that sort of made sense. But what the United States needs to do in the 21st century, and for the next however long we can make it last, is convince the rest of the world that we're, mostly benign hegemon. Maybe you don't like us, maybe you don't respect us, but you're content to let us stay in charge for a while. I mean, that's U.S. interest as I see it. And that is not, the madman strategy has zero application if that's what you're trying to do. If you're trying to convince the rest of the world that you're like a decent, not too harmful hand on the tiller, convincing the rest of the world that you're fucking nuts is not helpful.
Yeah. And the other thing, which you mentioned earlier, is that, world instability, it's in general bad for everybody, but it's worst for whoever's trying to run the system, right?
Exactly.
Whoever's the most dependent on the rest of the world. And in as much as the U.S. is the biggest player on the stage, we're also the most dependent on every other country staying intact, right? Mm-hmm. Because of trade, all sorts of,
Absolutely.
And something that Rob and I have mentioned in previous shows is that one of the things that keeps the world stable is countries in general, and the U.S. in particular, being predictable.
Yes.
Right? Because there's this example that everybody gets if they take an international relations class, which is Iraq. At the end of the Iraq-Iran war and right before the invasion of Kuwait, where Iraq has a ton of debt from the Iran-Iraq war, and Saddam Hussein has a conversation with a U.S. diplomat, and that diplomat accidentally gives Saddam the impression that the U.S. is giving them the green light to invade Kuwait and recoup their war debts. And then Saddam does it, right? Because he thinks it's going to be okay. And then the U.S. has to go into Iraq or into Kuwait and throw the Iraqis out. And the idea of the example is that if the U.S. can broadcast its intentions very clearly, its military might and economic might will induce other countries in the world to do what it wants without it having to engage either the military or the economy to coerce people. Mm-hmm. That is that if you lay out the laws of the land, most people will just line up behind those.
Yes.
Because it's easier.
Yeah.
And if the laws of the land are an insane list of contradictory, racist, xenophobic directives,
but tough, but they're tough.
But
they're
tough.
Yeah.
That it's impossible for anyone to align with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I did a video on this recently. It's sort of like war is the problem that Washington, D.C. doesn't understand. And this isn't just a Trump problem. I mean, this is obviously a Bush problem and an Obama problem, who allowed people to convince him that it was a good idea to get involved in places like Libya and Syria. If you're the guy on top, if you're the United States, but okay, let's take it the other way. If you're China, it doesn't really matter what happens to you, what happens in Latin America. Like if there's instability there, China doesn't really care. If you're Iran, if there's instability in Southern Africa or between Japan and China, it doesn't really matter. But if you're the United States, instability anywhere has the potential to screw us mightily. And it's amazing that, I mean, it's a very, very simple, people love looking for really simple lessons from history, like don't get me started on fucking Graham Allison and the Thucydides trap. But this is one of the most basic lessons from any sort of transition from like one system to the next, is that it is war that brings it about. It is war that unseats the people on top. So it's freaking crazy that people are considering it somehow positive that the United States is getting more involved in the Middle East and contributing to instability in more countries. It's freaking nuts. It makes no sense at all.
Yeah. Sorry. Looking at the chat again. Two things I want to clarify from the chat, or based on what it appears I'm reading out of the chat. One is that, in case it wasn't clear enough, when I talk about Trump's statements being part of what diminishes our moral authority abroad, I'm absolutely referring to the racism, the xenophobia, stuff he says about Jews, weird retweets, Mexicans being rapists and murderers. Yeah, all that stuff, guys. That's what we're talking about.
But not just that. There's just
not just that stuff. But I just want to be clear. We're definitely talking about that also.
Yeah.
And the other thing is just I don't know. Never mind. I don't think we actually need to address this other thing I was looking at.
See, now I'm curious.
There's a difference between Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism but like. It's the internet. I don't think it's either necessary or worthwhile.
Yeah, we could. I feel like when we get to Israel, we end up talking about it for 45 minutes. So
yeah,
we can probably avoid that. But yeah, so we've got the racism, the xenophobia, also just Trump's attitude towards international institutions. It's like the John Birch Society or like the Breitbart comments section is sitting in the office of the president now. So things like the WTO, things like the United Nations are treated as enemy organizations when they are institutions. We wrote them, we run them, we essentially own them, and that just continues to bother me deeply. And also they take concrete steps, or rather, because it's the Trump administration, take concrete non-steps. There's the exact details escape me, but the World Trade Organization is, I think they have a judicial tribunal that is currently understaffed. The U.S. is, once again, it's the U.S. who gets to appoint these folks, and the U.S. just isn't doing it, which means that one of the central functions of the World Trade Organization is falling apart. Just out of sheer Trumpian neglect, malign neglect, and it's a really annoying thing to see.
Yeah, and I mean, we should stay on this as long as we have stuff to talk about. But I've only got like kind of one more topic,
all right,
or whatever, as far as Trump diminishing American power. Which is that one of the ways in which we get people to follow along in terms of international institutions is by acting in good faith. And in the WTO and the World Bank and the UN, we pretty much don't act with good faith, right? But one thing we tend to is in bilateral treaties. Generally, we set up bilateral treaties because we're actually interested in them, and we generally abide by their whatever, we abide by them. So there are two incredibly important international treaties in which we've begun to act in bad faith that I think are going to greatly diminish our ability to influence countries in the future. And those are the Iran nuclear deal and NAFTA.
Yeah.
So Iran, everybody should know about by now, which is that Iran is abiding by the terms of the nuclear agreement. The U.S. largely was not. And on top of that, Donald Trump is decertifying the deal despite the fact that Iran is abiding by it. There's a couple more steps to go there before the whole thing falls apart. But the big thing about that is if Donald Trump was legitimately trying to resolve the Korean situation, which I don't think he is, showing the Koreans that as soon as they make a nuclear deal, the second that it's advantageous for not the United States, but a president in the press or with his base or whatever to abrogate that deal, he's going to do it that very second, right? And so it means we're never gonna get a similar nuclear deal, right?
Nope. Well, like especially not with I don't know, North Korea, which might be a useful person to have a nuclear deal with.
Exactly. And the other thing is, so I'm not particularly concerned that the U.S. might not be able to involve countries in large, pro-corporate international trade agreements, but
I am a big fan of that. But
yeah, Rob would be unhappy about that. I'm not sure I actually mind, but it's not super high profile. But the Trump administration is trying to renegotiate NAFTA.
Yeah,
and there are trilateral talks going on between us, the Canadians, and the Mexicans. And despite the fact that Canada's a real country, I live in Mexico, and it's not. Despite the fact that even the Mexicans showed up having done their homework, the people that the Trump administration sent didn't have any idea what they're talking about. Not just in the sense that they weren't trained economists, but they hadn't read any of the provisions, any of the existing provisions of NAFTA. They didn't understand what was actually enforced. They didn't understand how to change it.
And this stuff is tremendously, tremendously complex. Like things about rules of origin, things about it's tremendous. The trade legislation has gotten very, very complex. It's not just about tariffs anymore. And the idea that Trump would just send some rubes who have no idea what they're talking about is.
And the other thing is, so, I'm not really sure that on the whole, NAFTA was good for Mexico, especially. It definitely wasn't good for auto manufacturing in the United States. But the thing of it is we're at a new equilibrium. We're at a new stable normal, right? Under the terms of NAFTA. And when you tinker with those, as an ignorant moron, what you're going to do is you're going to hurt a lot of people.
Yeah.
And very immediately and very directly. And in as much as nobody's paying attention to what's going on with NAFTA negotiations, that has so much more ability to hurt us as a country than anything that Iran's going to do.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, NAFTA is I think that gets to the sort of central point that I was making. It's like what actually matters in geopolitics for the United States, for people's lives in the United States, for business, for whatnot, is absolutely not anything that's happening in the Middle East anymore. I mean, in a couple disaster scenarios, like Saudi Arabia falls to pieces and nobody gets any oil anymore. Okay, yeah, that could potentially be a problem, but those are disastrous scenarios that we are making more likely. What is tremendously important is this NAFTA negotiation. It's a complex, arcane, boring-sounding thing for which the Trump administration has a really dumb approach. And if they do manage to blow that up, the effects will be infinitely larger than anything that's happening in the Middle East. And that's just another example of how Trump is screwing with things. And it's also fascinating. Nobody other than Donald Trump and a few superannuated dipshits. Like what is the Department of Commerce guy? The sort of 85-year-old. I can't remember. His name escapes me. But it's just these clowns who have certain knee-jerk approaches to trade deals. are really the only people that have any interest in reevaluating NAFTA or in getting rid of NAFTA. Everybody in business in the United States is just like, for the love of God, don't touch it, or actually improve it. Whereas, despite that, we've got this belligerent moron trying to destroy it, and it's really the only thing that's keeping him in check now. Is that also the entire Republican Party and every business donor to the Republican Party wants to preserve NAFTA, but there's no guarantee that that'll last.
Yeah. So like I said, that was my last thing. But just again to address the chat, it's so Robert Brown, who I'm not sure is necessarily a positive influence, asks, how do we know that Iran is abiding by the terms of the nuclear deal? Well, under the terms of the deal, there's a more thorough and pervasive inspections regime set up under the IAEA, which is, again, one of those international institutions that we pretty much run.
Yeah.
Than has ever been set up in any country ever before. And the IAEA has said, yeah, they're doing everything. They're doing everything they said they were going to do. And
also Trump's adults in the room, like Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, for however longer he's with us, have all also maintained and said that that Iran is honoring all the conditions. Once again, Nikki Haley, the gal who did not distinguish herself. Sorry, I think that that might have been a little sexist, actually. The former governor of North Carolina and our ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, I should not be referring to her as a gal, weighed in to sort of claim, and I think this is something that you'll find on Breitbart and also in a lot of sort of standard neocon places, is that Iran's missile program somehow screws with the terms of the deal. And no, it frickin' does not. It's about nukes. The deal is about nukes. And Iran has been complying completely with that. They happen to live in a neighborhood where the United States uses very belligerent language towards them and occupies 2 or 3 countries on their borders. So yes, they want to have the same sorts of missile technology that other places do. This is not something that was covered in the JCPOA, in the Iran deal. So no, when somebody any honest person in the Trump administration, any honest person in the Trump administration emphasizes that Iran is complying with the deal, and anybody who tells you they're not is inventing stuff. They're making stuff up. So yeah, Iran is complying with the deal.
Yeah. All right. So I haven't got anything else. I mean, I'm sure there's many other things, but I haven't got anything else laid out for specifics on how Donald Trump is diminishing this particular kind of power.
I mean, I think we've made it, I think, pretty clear. And once again, there is, I think there's sort of standard objections. So it's like, well, he defeated ISIS. So it's like he defeated ISIS by using Obama's approach and taking off all the governors that made Obama's approach slightly safer. He basically might have actually been the right gamble. Said that, okay, we're just going to go whole hog with supporting the Syrian Kurds, no matter what Turkey thinks. And yes, then of course, as could have been done at any point during the Obama administration, the ISIS issue was resolved fairly quickly. That actually might have been the right decision, but the idea that there's something new and clever here is something I disagree with. What I completely disagree with is the fact that we've now got 2,000 troops in Syria. We've now got more troops in Iraq, more troops in Yemen. I don't have the exact figures at my fingertips, but this is not, as I think our discussion or foregoing discussion will reveal, this is not a sign of strength. This is a sign of letting the military do whatever it wants. And there are no good military solutions to these issues, especially in Yemen, where our military is very much a part of the problem. So yeah, I just want to deal with those sort of standard objections. So yeah, you got to focus on more than the Middle East, because the Middle East is getting less and less important every day.
Yeah, and just a thing to add there. or two things. One is that Robert Brown, if you're not just a troll in the chat and you really believe that Donald Trump is somehow increasing U.S. power abroad, please lay that out for us and we'll talk about whatever you got.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert Brown, please tell us what Trump has done that has improved Donald Trump's the U.S. position and power and prestige. Actually, anybody in the chat who, I mean, if there's a objection we haven't dealt with, please lay it out. Please let us know, and we'll talk about it right now. Before we get into the promised second half of our discussion, which is the question: is Donald Trump's destruction of U.S. power a good thing? But before we get to that, let's fully establish that Donald Trump is destroying U.S. power. Who's got an objection?
So one other thing that you said that I think is worth repeating every day until we're dead, maybe soon, is there are no good military solutions.
Yes.
Right? So there may be times, and I think they're pretty rare, when the only solution to a problem is military. That may exist in some hypothetical world, but military solutions are never good, right? You know, as soon as you got people shooting at each other, you're committing moral wrongs, right? You know, maybe,
it's not.
Sorry, go ahead.
And it's not just the use of U.S. military forces; it's using CIA or other funding to bring about military conflicts. It's never the good response.
And Loga Cool Extreme, I guess, says, what about World War II? Yeah, okay, you can have good wars, but the second a war begins, civilians are getting killed, people are dying, which is just always a bad thing.
Actually, I have an answer to that, actually, if I can interrupt.
Well, yeah, sorry. I real quick, moral wrongs are happening the second you're getting into a conflict, and you're spending just so much money because we think about Tomahawk missiles and all the stuff that the U.S. spends on that is so expensive, but even putting two boots on the ground anywhere is $1 million a year base price. Military solutions are always bad solutions, morally and financially.
There's two. So to that World War II question, actually, I don't have to go back to World War II to find something to which there was only a military solution. ISIS. ISIS is something to which there was only a military solution. But ISIS existed because of two military solutions that the United States had chosen to take. ISIS would not have been initially established if it weren't for the botched, or really the existing invasion of Iraq. And ISIS would not have gotten the opening that it needed to make its incredible push in 2014 if it had not been for the military solution that the United States was fostering against Assad. So ISIS was, yes, and I think that's actually the case. This might go a little too far off in the fever swamps for John, but I would argue that's the case with World War II as well. I've written at some length about how I'm pretty sure that if we hadn't intervened in World War I, which was a conflict with no good people, there were no good guys in World War I. There were a bunch of imperial bastards who decided to kill themselves, and the Germans basically won this conflict, and then the United States jumped in, and if we hadn't done that, there would be no Hitler. So yes, that's in the nature of military solutions, is that they actually make, once you go in and break things, you can't unbreak things easily. So that's the story of us in Iraq, is you can't pick out, oh, well, ISIS, of course. I mean, obviously, you're going to want to bomb the shit out of ISIS, but the reason ISIS exists is because of Iraq. Obviously, you're going to want to put together, do anything you can to defeat Hitler in World War II. But the reason that problem exists is because we chose to get involved in European power games in World War I. There's a reason that there are infinite numbers of World War II movies. I mean, you turn on the television right now, and if you flip through it, you'll find some kind of appreciation of World War II, and there is nothing on World War I. Except Wonder Woman this year, weirdly, and they just sort of mapped how we feel about World War II onto World War I, which was very weird.
Wasn't that super messed up? They were trying to like
super messed
Nazify
up.
World War I Germans. That was super weird.
Yeah, they made like Ludendorff this like Nazi super criminal. I'm like, I mean, he wasn't a great guy. He was a bit of a militarist schmuck. We're apparently big fans of that kind of guy in the United States now. But yeah, he wasn't a crazy Nazi. Yeah, so they basically did World War I because they thought it would be kind of interesting, and just wrote the script as if it was World War II. So yes, even World War II, which was absolutely worthwhile use of military force, has its roots in a unwise use of military force.
Yeah, and I mean, you can say World War II was a good war while also acknowledging the terror bombing of Europe, the fire bombing of Tokyo, the 2 atom bombs, and the people that died. It's okay for a good war to still be a bad thing.
Yeah, for sure.
This
oh God. Okay, so Robert Brown.
Stuff in the chat.
Yeah, Robert Brown has weighed in. $6 trillion added to the value of U.S. stocks since Trump came to power. Islam had a shot fired across its bows. Supreme Court upheld Trump's Muslim
wrong bows.
It's
the wrong bows. Unless we're flying across the tree of Islam and not the boat.
I was just going to assume I'm not going to light into this guy for his inability to spell or put together thoughts. So I think those are worth dealing with. Okay, the Supreme Court upheld Trump's Muslim vigilance. This bugs me because that's absolutely not true. The Supreme Court did eventually, in a very guarded and caveated way, say that Trump's ban could go forward. However, if you compare that to what he initially proposed in January that had all of us out protesting at airports, it is nothing like what was eventually approved by the Supreme Court. I think this isn't just a Breitbart problem. I think that's been misreported by everybody.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Supreme Court also didn't approve the new ban. It just said that it couldn't be stopped by an injunction and actually has to go through the courts to be stopped, right?
And also, I think there was something to do with the fact that the initial ban was time limited. So yeah, it bugged me that wasn't. Okay, so $6 trillion added to the value of U.S. stocks since Trump came to power. This is fascinating to me. So I spent, as I said, I had a not a Republican, but a much more conservative past, and I've read decades of interpretation talking about how you couldn't possibly give Bill Clinton credit for the economic boom during the Clinton years. That was all Ronald Reagan and what he did, you got to understand, this is from conservatives, you got to understand economies don't work immediately like that. And the reason the economy did so well under Clinton, that was all Reagan. And then to immediately, like from March, like 2 months into the Trump presidency, to just sort of instantly assume that everything that happens to the stock market is due to his actions is wrong.
So this is interesting. I differ with you here. Mm-hmm. I think the stock market is 100% going up because of Trump. It's going up because corporate investors are expecting the sell-offs of public property to the private sector. So if you look at Chile right after Pinochet takes over, their stock market explodes because people are super happy to buy up all the great stuff that the state has built and sell it off to private industry. So that's
it's not privatization. It's the corporate tax cut we just got. I mean, there's not a ton of that in the US.
That's what I'm saying. Expectation of stuff like that and stuff like the corporate tax cut, all of which benefits the investor class. That's certainly true, but it's not doing anything for me, and it's not doing anything for the vast majority of working people in the United States. So, in as much as Trump's created this sort of weird idiot bubble in the stock market, it's not doing anybody any good, except with the people who are already doing really well. So he's right, but wrong at the same time.
I think giving a sitting president who's been there for 8 months credit for an expansion doesn't make a lot of sense. Though there is no disputing that it did start with his election, as you said, of that expectation of success. Also, the idea that $6 trillion has been added to the value of U.S. stocks, I don't see that as particularly sustainable. I mean, who knows? But I think we've got quite a correction coming, and it'd be interesting watching. Islam has had a shot fired across its bows.
I'm not sure I get that one.
How exactly? You mean when Trump, for his first visit to first international visit, went to Saudi Arabia and did a sword dance and talked about how he was totally on board with the home of the ideology of 9/11 being our big ally, and how we were going to get on board with them further? Like, was that shooting a blast across Islam's bows? I don't really. Okay, I think Kim now shitting himself. Yeah, no, I think Kim is pretty.
I think Kim is very happy with the way things have been going.
Delighted, in fact.
Yeah. All right. Well, so I think that's a good segue, along with the stuff we were talking about military conflict, to this second thing that I had in this first part of the show, which is that in as much as our diplomatic power is certainly declining, that is our power to bring other people along in collective projects, our power to harm hasn't diminished at all. Our military power and the sort of it grows out of the military, and North Korea is a great example here, because you and I have talked in like every show we've ever done. U.S. threats, U.S. grandstanding, this kind of stuff that that Donald Trump is doing towards North Korea helps out exactly one constituency, which is the dictators in power in the other country. The prime beneficiary, which is why we don't agree with the idea that Kim is shitting himself, is that the prime beneficiary of Donald Trump's rhetoric on North Korea is Kim Jong-un, his position in his country. And we're able to do that no matter how worthless we are diplomatically. We're able to be the big bad for Kim, for the mullahs in Iran, for the conservative elements in Cuba, for Maduro in Venezuela.
And when we talk about Trump destroying U.S. power, we're not saying he's taking it down to zero. I think we're saying that he's taking it from a higher point to a much lower point. I think it was Alibaba, said that the U.S. will be number one for decades. And I think that's absolutely true. I think economically, in terms of military, what have you, like, we will be. I've said over and over in my videos that I think this idea that there's some imminent U.S. collapse is fantasy. The question is, what happens after that? What happens beyond that? Like, are we going to do what the British Empire did, which was get progressively more and more violent, more and more dangerous to the rest of the world, until the rest of the world just sort of says enough? If that's your goal, if that's your patriotic approach, wanting a tough military, then I don't really see you as much of a patriot. Sorry, I'm speaking to the general. I think something that I desperately want to happen is I want this system that we have built, that we wrote, to persist and to continue. And if we choose to make everything just about the military, and hold on, grasp onto that military power and build more bases and get more and more involved in that, which is exactly what the Trump administration has been doing, despite promising not to, on the campaign trail, then we'll destroy the chance of a sort of lasting, peaceful existence under U.S. institutions, which I would like. And I think I'm watching that possibility slip away. It's not like, because Trump is president in 4 to 8 years, China's going to take New York or something. Heck no. No, of course not. It's just we're turning ourselves into sort of a sad, knee-jerk rogue state. Sort of like Russia, actually, except, 10 to 20 times more powerful. And that I think is a tremendous loss of power and potential. I'm not talking about us just sort of disappearing off the world stage, because we can't. We can't do that. But I am talking about us falling, and the sort of potential and opportunity for the world of a sort of lasting peace, something that lasts decades or centuries rather than another couple decades. is slipping away fairly quickly. And I think that's a tragedy.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of power to harm, it's not just rhetorically. By the way, Rob, is there any way you can pull a curtain or something?
No, I can't.
No.
I was hoping to use a different office, but instead I get sun in my face. So yeah, we get this sort of, it's sort of a chiaroscuro, except instead of black, you have mottled pink. It's good.
Looks good though. Looks good.
Right?
But so the other thing is, it's not just this power to use rhetoric in a negative way, that reinforces the people we'd least like to reinforce abroad. Mm-hmm. At a certain point, especially when the military seems to be the chief voice in the White House, or as somebody pointed out, the military-industrial complex, not your business. And at a time when there are fewer and fewer strong diplomatic voices to oppose that military voice, mm-hmm. It becomes a very real possibility that we actually use our military in a harmful way. And I don't know if you saw this, but there's an article out yesterday that Trump's directed the Pentagon to begin planning a quote-unquote bloody nose attack to dissuade the North Koreans from, I don't know, tweeting at Donald Trump, whatever it is we're trying to dissuade them from doing.
Oh, that's fucking insane. I had not seen that. That's fucking insane.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane in the most literal possible interpretation of the word insane.
So I there is no military solution to North Korea, but if you imagine there is one, what you should be talking about is an instant, overwhelming sort of, what would they call it, Colin Powell doctrine, like take over the country, bomb every conceivable site imaginable immediately. That's the only thing you're kind of, but give him a bloody nose. That's I think something that isn't emphasized enough about North Korea is that the demilitarized zone is what, 20, 40 miles from Seoul, from the capital of South Korea. So if it looks to North Korea as if some kind of military thing is starting and happening, then they can just start shelling our South Korean ally and just start shelling a city of what? Oh gosh, it's a mega city, right? 5-10 million people. And also it's not, I mean, obviously any kind of actions against the city are horrific and whatnot, but this is not what we've been doing in the Middle East. We're sort of, semi-targeted approaches that only kill 10,000 people. They're just going to start shooting mortars at high rises in one of the most developed cities in the world. So yeah, the idea of a fucking bloody nose attack in North Korea is nuts.
Yeah, and I mean, in as much as maybe this guy Robert Bowen, I think, and I'm as reluctant as you to do it, but I think going into the second hour, we might want to surgically excise him from the chat because everybody else is like really pretty productive here.
Well, it's useful having a real Trump supporter.
Yeah, well, that's my question, whether or not it's actually real. But the other thing with North Korea or with Iran or whatever you want to look at, but especially North Korea, is case for somebody living in Iraq in 2003 who wants to take up arms against the American invader for real enmity with an American soldier, because we have an all-volunteer military, Mm-hmm. Those guys chose to join up and fight abroad. You look at North Korea, which has like the third largest standing army in the world, something like that. Mm-hmm. That's a country where all of the population has been indoctrinated. And if it hasn't been indoctrinated, it has at least been forced into service of the state. Mm-hmm. The state run by perhaps a madman, somebody certainly less mad than our own head of state. And any military solution to North Korea is going to imply the deaths of tens of millions of people. I think we like to think about it in terms of a U.S. foreign policy problem or whatever, but tens of millions of dead people. Yeah. And that's, when you can be blasé about bloodying the North Korean nose, but that's a lot of blood to have on your hands, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I don't want to get it too off into the weeds on North Korea. So I think we should get to Something that I have been thinking about seriously, I think I've kind of discarded it. Is this potentially a good thing? I mean, I know you've got a podcast that documents in great detail the horrors that have come about as a result of U.S. foreign policy. If you look at this incredible diminishing in U.S. soft power, is it possible to see that as a good thing?
Yeah, well, so in this one sense, yeah, I think a diminished ability of the United States to pretend that it's acting in good faith as it supports, odious regimes abroad, I think that could be a good thing. I'm not sure that a diminished diplomatic power actually does that, though.
But absolutely does, because if it gets to the point where people are willing, I think it'll be instructive what's happening in the United Nations today, as I think most of the General Assembly is going to be opting to condemn the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. I mean, if it gets to the point where people are no longer as willing to play along, and people start looking to China more for leadership on these issues, I don't think that that's certainly not going to be the case for anybody on China's border. But I would say that in Europe right now, people are thinking, well, shit. I mean, obviously, we're going to maintain our military relationship and this, that, and the other thing with the United States. But when it comes to specific policy initiatives that the United States wants us to get behind, we now have more options. This just sort of degree of insanity means that they can start flirting with China more. And China's a little bit nerve-wracking, because they have a future as a sort of a hyperpower, but start flirting with Russia more. Why not? Once again, that won't happen on Russia's border, but I think we're already seeing movement in France and Germany towards Russia from as a direct result of Trump's approach to Europe. Yeah, I don't know that. I think it absolutely impacts our ability to do whatever we want.
Well, so what Rob was trying to throw to me a minute ago was something that we've talked about, I think, in almost every one of these shows, and what is certainly kind of the thesis statement of my podcast, which is that American foreign policy, I think, on the whole, has really been bad for the world, but it's been bad in very particular and outside of the countries involved, less obvious ways than the way it's been good, than ways in which it's been good. And there was something I wanted to bring up for this show, for this exact part of this live show, in which maybe I was thinking about arguing that a diminishment of U.S. power abroad could have been a good thing. Mm-hmm. And it's this quote that I came across in my senior year of college when I was writing a thesis, a senior thesis about some pretty esoteric stuff in like the last 20 years of the Cuban regime. But anyway, it's this quote from an interview that Fidel Castro gave to Playboy in 1985, the second of two Playboy interviews.
Quoting Castro, all right.
Yeah, from Playboy, which if anybody doesn't know, and I don't know why anyone would know anymore, the Playboy interview used to be like a pretty serious institution. And the people they sent down to interview Castro, it was like one congressman, two senators, and like two or three pretty serious journalists.
Wow.
And nobody actually employed by Playboy, which is strange. But anyway, they take like 3 whole days of tape and they cut it down to an article that I think is like 10,000 words long. It's like as long as a short book. But Castro says this, quote, "I wonder, is there any fascist regime in the past 40 years that has not been an ally of the United States? In Spain, the Franco regime. In Portugal, the Salazar regime. In South Korea, the fascist military. In Central America, Somoza, the military dictatorships in Guatemala and El Salvador. And Stroessner, the military dictatorships in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, as well as the Duvalier regime. I don't know of any reactionary fascist state that has not been a close ally of the United States," unquote. And to that, we could add, I don't know, whatever else you want. You could add,
I don't know, man. I think Castro,
Egypt. You could add.
I don't know, man. I think I'm not really going to call Fidel Castro an impartial observer in this. I think, well, I absolutely do not dispute that we supported a bunch of evil bastards It's the fact that we're still supporting them today outside of the context of the Cold War that bothers me.
Yeah. And the thing about it is, I mean, the thing that made the quote powerful for me at the time was I was much less of a leftist. And it blew me away that somebody that I thought I disagreed with on principle on pretty much everything said something so true and so damning about U.S. foreign policy. And moreover, something that I hadn't really been educated about in my time studying exclusively foreign policy in D.C. But the thing about it is, in as much as I think he's right, and in as much as there's a whole other list of countries that we were involved in doing bad stuff, like, for example, Iran, the series that I just finished, I'm not sure that a diminishing of our diplomatic power necessarily will make it that much harder for us to keep doing exactly that, you know? I'm not sure that Hosni Mubarak in Egypt needed to respect our moral authority to keep taking money and arms from us. You know, it's pretty obvious that the Saudis do. They're happy to receive whatever it is that we're willing to give, despite the fact that Donald Trump is out there disparaging.
They're paying. They're paying.
So, you know, I'd like to be able to argue that maybe Donald Trump shrinking or diminishing or whatever our leadership role in the world is a good thing, you know, trying to find that silver lining to a pretty gross situation. But I'm not sure there is one.
And I'm honestly not sure either, though my thought on this, I've been pleasantly surprised actually by how well things have held together in the face of the United States. I think my approach, I'm becoming a bit of a globalist, and I sort of look forward to the day when these institutions can sort of restrain all negative actors, you know, be it Russia, China, or the United States. And I do feel like I've seen the beginnings of that. I've seen the beginnings of sort of a broader international system that yes, it's definitely a very neoliberal institution, which you might not agree with, has neoliberal characteristics. But, you know, just sort of, and I know it's not something to be taken particularly seriously or sincerely, but just the Chinese leader going to Davos and talking about how he's going to be the leader when it comes to climate change and free trade, and honestly watching the way that the world seems to be rallying to whine about this Jerusalem move. It does lead me to believe that it's like maybe that system, it's not there yet, but I'm beginning to see the outlines of a true international system that can sort of gang up on folks, gang up on great powers like the United States or China, and I like that. I like that a lot. But I don't think. But I guess for very different reasons, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think the institutions have that weight. What's interesting about that is it wouldn't really be that hard, and I wonder why more, or that expensive, why more states in Latin America or Europe or gosh, even some states in Africa now aren't chipping in more to international institutions, because you know, as of this point, I mean, Nikki Haley and Trump, they might be thugs with their approach, but it is true that the United States still picks up the bill for a lot of this stuff. But so for sort of smaller countries that have sort of made it work to a degree under the Washington Consensus, you know, like Chile, for example, or a lot of countries in Europe, a lot of countries in Asia, like, why don't they put more money into these institutions? Because these institutions, despite the fact that they were written by the United States and have functioned thus far to preserve U.S. power, there's a real potential there to use those institutions to constrain all the large powers. And that's something I'm very hopeful about. I don't think we're there yet, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're talking about, you know, negatives of a loss of, or about, I don't know, negatives of what's going on with the Trump administration internationally, you know, in the first part of the show, I was saying that international multilateral institutions have been extremely effective in allowing the U.S. to impose its will on the rest of the world. And I think a lot of that influence has been negative. But like I think Rob does, I have great hope, or maybe I had at one point great naive hope for international institutions. You know, I'm one of those people that gets weepy about the death of the League of Nations. You know, this first great attempt to outlaw war. And I think there's some, you know, maybe we're in the darkest timeline, but there's some reality out there in which the United Nations worked, you know. And
we're not in the darkest timeline, man. Like,
all right, fair enough. But when Donald Trump exposes, you know, to the extent that international institutions work, they work because we all maintain the fantasy that they are what they say they are. You know, that the UN isn't run by the Security Council, or that the IMF isn't controlled from Washington. And when Donald Trump gets up to disparage the only great collective projects of the human race, it makes it that much more unlikely and that much farther in the future that they'll ever be what they say they are. I
gotta disagree with that, actually, because he's such a fucking comic book villain of a moron that he actually might inspire people to sort of cleave to these institutions anymore. I think his creation of the fiction, and it is a fiction, that it is a fiction today, that these institutions are somehow opposed to U.S. interests. His creation of that fiction could actually develop, lead to what he's talking about, which is a point where these institutions are more funded by other powers and are more representative of what the world as a whole actually wants. I think that's a real possibility. And if I were sitting in, I don't know, South Korea or Poland or Chile, I'd take a look at what the promise, you know, maybe not how they actually work, but what the promise of these international institutions are, and realize that if we do fall into what Trump seems to be angling for, and certainly what would be the case under, you know, broader influence for Russia or China, that if we do fall back into a place where it's, you know, great powers struggling against each other, that's all that matters, they lose big. So I almost wonder if Trump's comic book villain nature might inspire more buy-in to these institutions. You think there's any possibility of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe, but I think what needs to happen. Yeah, I think you got a point, right? I think it's possible that what you're describing could be a process that plays out, but it seems to me that as long as the guy that's doing what Trump is doing is in charge of one of the vetoes on the UN Security Council, I think it makes it difficult for any of that to develop. You know what I mean?
But it's fascinating, actually, and this is just another. Just think about that. I don't know. Is that the first time it's happened? The resolution on Jerusalem, the Security Council resolution, where the U.S. Vetoed it essentially, but it was 14-1 against the United States. Has that ever happened before? I mean, actually, I'm sure it's happened with a number of Israel resolutions, but actually, I'm not sure. I just don't know my diplomatic.
No, I think usually we're able to bully some of the other people on the. Yeah. I think it's almost always going, especially on Israel-Palestine issues. I think it's almost always going to be a 14-1, and then we have to go bully some other parties to come along with us. I think you might be right. It might be the first time.
Yeah, and that's that. I mean, to actually see in the United Nations, in the Security Council, I mean, that's the position that usually Russia and China. Well, actually, when Russia and China get it together to veto something that everybody else wants, they've got two normally. So it's actually kind of heartening in a way to see that just unified condemnation. I mean, it's terrifying from the perspective of someone in the United States who cares about the continuation of U.S. power, but it does place doubts in my mind. It it's like, well, maybe, we can do without U.S. power. And that gets back to my libertarian roots. That sounds fucking fantastic if the U.S. could just sort of pull back and the world would continue to operate. I absolutely don't think we're there yet. But I don't know. There's just a dash of hope. But I would actually, having thought about it more and I've been reading a lot about the 19th century British Empire run up to World War I now. And if we can get to a point where U.S. power fades and it fades into this broader system with buy-in and consequences and something that the whole world, then fantastic. That is the desired result. What I see with Trump acting out in this way at this point so early in the process is I see a more likely return to multipolarity. So multiple poles of power throughout the world. So you've got sort of the United States getting more aggressive about its interests, China getting more aggressive about its interests. And you've already got this kind of shit starting. Like there is a new scramble for Africa that nobody's talking about yet. Famously, the scramble for Africa was when, with no economic rationale, most of the powers of Europe tried to divide Africa up, and brought about a number of horrific results. But we've got that happening in Africa right now as well. You've got China, piling in economically, and you've got the United States piling in militarily, supposedly dealing with Islamic radicalism, but not really. So that kind of shit is terrifying. Because if you look back into a multipolar structure, even if you look back to the Cold War, and you'd pointed out all these horrific folks that we supported, all these fascist dictatorships or whatnot. Even if you just go back to there, if you go back to even a two-pole world, U.S. versus China, then all of a sudden you've got every little dipshit civil war somewhere turns into a proxy war, and the world gets much, much worse. And that's why I'm not yet ready for U.S. power to diminish the way that it is under Donald Trump. I think that these institutions aren't strong enough to maintain peace and prosperity without the U.S. as number one. As a not respected, but a tolerated number one. And I think Trump is dealing with that. So my answer to the question, is Donald Trump's destruction of U.S. power a good thing, would be no, not yet.
So
any thoughts on that?
There's no, I don't, well, not particularly.
No.
I mean, I'm more in the boat of not your business that multipolar systems tend to be pretty unstable.
Yeah.
I don't know, trying to scry into the next century, especially given that I'm much more pessimistic about climate change than you are. It's like, it all looks dark to me, but dark in a way that's difficult to perceive,
I still maintain I'm an optimist. I think the world is getting better all the time. And I think that to the extent that Trump's presidency can be instructive, I think it has definitely underlined the way that a number of things are broken in the United States and in the world at large. It could be a teachable moment. And if it actually does encourage the rest of the world to start valuing these institutions more, then hey, maybe it's exactly what the world needs. That's a tremendously, that's looking for a very thin silver lining around a pretty horrifically large cloud.
Well, I tell you what, I might actually, and I'm going to need your expertise on this, but there might actually be one positive international relations thing coming out of the Trump administration. I think it's a bit of an accident. But so it came out in the news yesterday or 2 days ago that some Trump proxy had announced that the administration's official policy on Syria was now that Bashar al-Assad is good to stay in until the next national elections in that country.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. And what it sounds like to me is that we're getting on board with a plan by the powers who are actually managing the conflict, that is Russia and Iran, where they may have found a way to get Bashar al-Assad out, to end the civil war, and to do it reasonably soon.
I don't think I don't buy that Assad's going anywhere. But
no, my impression was that perhaps they'd worked out some sort of thing where he gets to stay on long enough to pretend that he's been voted out normally,
and then
and then retire to peaceful exile in Switzerland or whatever.
Yeah, maybe the Russians think they have that, but I'd be surprised if the Iranians were on board. I don't know. I honestly haven't been following Syria as closely as I should. I'm touched. You'd consider I have expertise, but I do have to say that Trump, and I have said elsewhere, that Trump has been fantastic for Syria. He, in a very knee-jerk way. It's occasionally helpful to have an idiot who's a president. My understanding, or at least apocryphally, the leak or the rumor was that somebody showed him a clip of one of our moderate opposition decapitating a child, and he said, "What the fuck? Why are we supporting that?" So he ended Timber Sycamore, the CIA program that destroyed Syria, essentially, in my reading of it. And yeah, that is helpful. The fact that he's decided to end our straightforward partnership with Al-Qaeda and affiliates in Syria is fantastic. It's good for Syria, and it's good for long-term potential for peace. I'm not aware of that, what you're talking about. And that's great. And that's, I think, the extent to, and yes, that actually should be credited to Trump. But I think also that program was such a manifest failure. I do think that if we had a Clinton presidency, there'd be a much higher chance that we'd be in a shooting war in Syria right now, and that is something worth noting, and that is something that Trump has done right. But once again, we're talking about one country in one region, rather than, which is not something that, despite what our media's approach to things, that's not a luxury that the United States has, to focus on one country and one region, because the Trump policy in the rest of the Middle East, and actually in Syria, because my understanding is now we've got 2,000 boots on the ground in Syria, and they're just gonna, I don't know, sit there until they start a war with Iran. So I can't call Trump a uniformly positive influence on Syria, but yes, his ending of that CIA program that consistently armed Al-Qaeda, and it's interesting, there's a report, I'm still going through it, that also makes it, I don't know, I can't quite make the claim yet, but also probably was initially, before 2014, was arming ISIS as well. So it's great that Trump ended that program. Sorry if I'm babbling.
No. I mean, I don't know how much credit's due there. It seems like an accident more than like intelligent policymaking to me. But
hey, I'll take in the era of Trump, I will take a happy accident.
Yeah. And the other thing to say there is, Rob and I, we don't like Bashar al-Assad. We're not Assad supporters. We don't go out and rally for him. All about his Twitter account. It's just you got to end a bad war that's not going anywhere. And it's not going anywhere really fast, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dead people.
Yeah. Bashar Assad is an evil, terrible man. And we should have done everything sensible in our power to get him out of power. But what we did was not sensible. And military solutions, once again, are never. There have been many figures like Bashar al-Assad in 20th century history. And what has worked over and over and over again is you bribe them. You get in bed with them economically, you get them rich, and then they get voted out or they fade away. That's how you deal with a mass murderer. Or you can create some kind of military involvement that destroys the country for decades to come, which is what we did in Syria, which sucks.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if I have anything specifically on the topics of the show.
I think I pretty much chat my wad as well. Should we go to questions? Does anybody have questions?
And we can look through the chat, but if anybody's got something they really want us to talk about, definitely put it in there again.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we can't. So we only see what's directly in front of us. So if you've got a question, please repeat yourself and throw it in there, and we will perhaps deal with it.
Well, there's one from, I think, Not Your Business from way back, which is what do we say about the assertion that U.S. power has been more benevolent than other superpower systems?
Oh, that's interesting. That's actually what have you got? Have you got an answer? You can go first.
No, take a crack at it, because I got some thoughts, but I think I need to put them in a row.
So I've this is something that I've been looking at in great detail, and yes, I think that the U.S. has, to some extent, been more benevolent than former great power systems, and it's part of this I would like, and I think there is something to it. At least the way that we see ourselves, even today, there is no conscious ideology of empire in the United States. Like, the US people aren't really that interested in running around the world and telling people what to do. That is what the US government has done, absolutely, for the past 70 years. But for the US people, you know, we're about freedom and This almost never translates into the actual US policy. But I do think that is better, and that has, to some degree, acted as a constraint on what the United States can do as a power. Because if you compare the US to Britain, as I am doing right now in a book I'm trying to write called Avoiding the British Empire, you can see that the United States is on almost every metric just sort of infinitely more powerful than the British Empire was, in terms of manpower, in terms of meaningful rivals, in terms of any kind of military power you'd want. We are much, much, much more powerful, but we don't control that much territory. We've got, 800 to 1,000 military bases across the planet, but we're not painting sections of the map red, white, and blue the way the British Empire did. I think there is some benevolence, some positive aspects to that, but I think it's way, way oversold. Something I've done a video on, specifically, it's like why China will never rule the world is there is really only one other imperial system that I think it makes any sense to compare us to, and that's the British system. Because if you're talking about a comparison to Rome or the Mongols or the Persians or any one of a number of other historical empires, even the Portuguese or the Spanish, you're talking about a tremendously different historical and technological era. You're talking about a period of time where most people couldn't read. I think a lot of the reasons why the British Empire was able to take power in so many places was, it had a little bit to do with the fact that they had machine guns, and the folks back then didn't have AK-47s, but it also had to do with ideas of nationalism and sort of self-respect of countries and whatnot, that these ideologies couldn't really build up when most of the world spent most of its time farming dirt and may not have been able to read. We're now in a point in time where most of the world can read. Most of the world has a sense of its own national will and its own. There were always people in individual countries and regions that had these individual senses, but now these are mass senses. A given Iraqi or a given Afghan, well, more than there used to be, given Afghans have a sense of themselves as either Afghan or Iraqi or whatever particular group they affiliate themselves with, and they are angry that someone would come in there and try and tell them what to do. So yes, the United States is a somewhat more benevolent hegemon, but does that have to do with the fact that we're nicer and better people, or does that have to do with the fact that the world is actually much more, individual foreign countries have much more power against us than they used to? If Vietnam had worked out, if we'd somehow just sort of figured it all out and made Vietnam work, then would we have moved on to Korea and, moved across and actually created a more formal U.S. empire? It was quite clear if you read about what the Bush administration was about, they thought that 9/11 meant that, okay, we're gonna set up American values everywhere. They thought we were going to take Iraq, and then we were going to take Syria, and then we were going to move on to Iran. that was their plan for 2003, 2004, 2005, or at least that's what some people were thinking about. So I don't know if the virtue of U.S. empire has much to do with the United States as it does with just the way that the world has changed technologically and sort of historically. I think that's my take on that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the exact question, is the current system as conceived and more or less controlled by the United States more benevolent than other superpower systems? I think on its own terms, you know, if you evaluate each system under its own morality, I think it's not. Which might be an unfair way to do things, because if you look at the Roman system,
I think that's an unfair way to do things, but anyway, sorry.
Well, but what's interesting about it is if you look at the Roman system under Roman morality, for the most part, it's good. What they do to Carthage isn't necessarily, because they kind of make up excuses. They make up their casus belli. So that's, but the Roman system, more or less, despite, you know, slavery and all sorts of stuff that's abhorrent to us now, works on its own terms. You look at British imperialism, for the most part, it works on its own terms. Although, you know, massacres or whatever. But what's interesting about the U.S. system is explicitly based on an anti-imperial mindset among its own people, right? But it's an imperial system.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the places that you know, that I was talking about earlier, places where we've kind of installed our own guys and supported them in the interest of maintaining hegemon of power, especially in South America. We're doing it in direct contravention or contradiction with our stated values, you know?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's like highly immoral on its own terms. Whether it's more benevolent, thinking about our current conception of morality, maybe. You know, Rob and I disagree. I think neoliberalism has done quite a lot to oppress people around the world. I've you know, spent the last 2 years just reading about all the people we've gotten killed by supporting dictators abroad. Maybe, but, you know, not enough that I think you could say it for sure. You know, all superpower systems in the history of the world have been bad, to varying degrees of badness. And I think the way we think about this system right now shouldn't be to either try to think that we're worse than the British or the Romans, or to be self-aggrandizing about being better than either of those systems. The system is bad, and what we should be trying to do is improve it. To compare it, because I'm not sure it's a productive enterprise.
So I completely agree that the U.S. empire is absolutely the most hypocritical one in history. There's no question there. We're all about freedom and liberty and self-determination, unless you disagree with exactly the way we want to run things, and then we'll bomb you and sanction you and this, that, the other thing. I agree that it's very hypocritical, but just in terms of sheer body count, I mean, you bring up Carthage. And I think that's, I think whenever we talk about Rome, it's very important to talk about what actually was involved, or any kind of, because there's this sort of romance when we talk about, you know, Roman fighting, or, oh yeah, of course there was slavery, or medieval fighting. Carthage was, there were three wars that Rome fought against Carthage, and the third one was launched, and its explicit goal was the extermination and destruction of this empire that they'd already, I don't know if they defeated them twice, but they certainly had defeated them in the second war. And its explicit goal was the extermination of a people. And you can still go, you can see the ruins of Carthage today. I believe that's modern Tunis. I went there, and there ain't much left. I mean, this is a vast trading empire that was competitive with Rome, and its very place in the historical record has been wiped out. So I think if you're talking about comparing modern empires like the British and the United States to like old empires, it's I think a silly approach, but it's also worth emphasizing to deal with like this very real strain in sort of modern thinking. That's like, oh, maybe things were better before capitalism or better before, this range of technology or whatnot. It's like, it was, I mean, the Romans were quite genocidal. Though also, they also were hypocritical. They also, every time they went into a new place, they made a point of making big speeches about how they were attacked. It was their, it was they were the party that was in the wrong as they sort of marched through and genocided the fuck out of people. So yeah, I mean, the United States is tremendously hypocritical. As far as actual body count, I think probably, well, actually it's probably higher just because there's a lot more people now than there used to be. But I actually consider the end game when I consider the body counts of empires. So I actually consider World War I and World War II to be direct results of the fall of the British Empire. So
fair enough, yeah.
So yeah, sorry, I'm perhaps getting off topic. So have we got any questions? More questions to address?
Yeah, I haven't watched in the chat.
Oh, there was a thing. So I think, oh gosh, Logica Extreme. I did notice. Wanted to know why I thought the WTO was so great. And this actually comes to another issue. I'll try to do this briefly. I was actually happy that if you want to talk about a place where Donald Trump discarded sort of informal soft power, something that people point to is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was something that he refused to sign. And I actually was a fan of that decision because what the WTO is, and it has had really negative consequences for a range of economies. I don't know if you put it more on NAFTA or whatnot, but I think WTO is also seen as really hurting Mexico, is really hurting India, really hurting a number of countries because of the way that the initial steps of WTO negotiation basically said, okay, you got to sign up under this big treaty that everybody signed up for. We get an even playing field for everybody. But of course, the first thing that we're going to deal with when you sign up is how you're going to buy manufactured products, or we're going to have free trade in this class of products that you don't do. And then we're going to grow from there. That was the promise when the WTO was first signed in was it the 90s? I can't remember exactly when it was. The promise was, okay, sign up for this thing. We're all going to be at the same table. It's all going to be great. And there's going to be a lot of short-term pain because it's the developed countries that are going to win initially. But then we're going to have more negotiations. And we're going to, eventually deal with things like agriculture. We're actually eventually going to give developing countries more power vis-a-vis developed countries because we're all sitting at the same table. And what really pisses me off about the TPP and the TTIP is that now the WTO is now actually, as the capacity has been built in developing countries, is now getting to the point where occasionally it dings the United States, occasionally it dings Europe, and really importantly with the Doha round, which has failed, the developed world at the WTO wanted everybody in the WTO to sign all of this stuff on services and intellectual property, stuff that developed countries really care about. And everybody else at the WTO was like, fuck you. No, we're not going to do that until you give us this stuff that we were promised back in the 90s or 2000s, until this WTO starts working for all of us. And that's the thing. The progress of the WTO is this broad-based thing. The rest of the world can hang it up. Unfortunately, the result of a couple developed countries, led by the United States, to the failure of the Doha round was to come up with this TPP, and then which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which dealt with Pacific trade deals, and then the TTIP, which I can't remember what it exactly says, but that was with the Atlantic. It's basically like a new free trade deal with Europe. So basically, these fucking agreements were like, oh, okay, the big club that we made everybody suffer to join, it's not working out for us anymore, so we're going to start new, smaller clubs. So the WTO, the way it's written, the way it functions now, should begin to work in a way that works for India, for China, for large developing countries, and smaller developing countries as well. It's, their trade tribunals are provided that I mean, it probably doesn't happen much in practice, but like Nicaragua or Papua New Guinea can bring a case against the United States. So that's beginning to work. So absolutely, the WTO has had negative aspects, but I think it's now at a point where it can evolve into something better. It actually is at that point, which is why we're seeing things like the TPP and the TTIP. I hope that answered your question. Logic, cool, extreme. You have anything on that?
I'm glad you did that. I'm totally unqualified to talk about it.
I spent a semester reading WTO decisions, so I know a little bit of trade law.
Yeah, and I'm a sharp guy, but everybody's only get so much time, and I on other whatever. Anyway, I do have a couple of questions that I've been taking them down from the chat.
Oh, nice.
So here, just actually no, I got one that I want to talk about. So Robert Brown again. I don't know why I'm constantly talking to the maybe the least productive member of this chat, but he said, there have always been empires, and they have, for the most part, never apologized. Did Genghis Khan ever apologize? Yeah, the world has always had oppressive political systems, and the Thucydides trap, for the last 3,000 years, and for the 7,000 years before that, the strong have done what they can, and the weak have suffered what they must.
Million dialogue, motherfuckers.
Yeah, and the great challenge of civilization, and especially of international civilization, has been to rise above that basest of all human relationships. So yeah, empires historically have not apologized for the things they've done wrong. And that doesn't mean that's the law of the universe that we need to follow forever, I think apologizing for the things you've done wrong is the first step to maybe no longer doing those things. And the great hope that grew out of the horrible events of the 20th century is that we may be able to create international institutions that allow us to move, finally, after 10,000 years of human history, to the second step.
I agree with that. I agree with that completely, and I think I'm sort of playing with that concept right now, and I think we really have the opportunity to transcend the shitstorm that is all of human history, and I think that actually gets to why answering questions about is the U.S. more benevolent? I think that the more history I read, the more I do realize that we have made incredible progress. It's 100 years ago, at the outset of World War I, I guess that's now 105 years ago, most of the world was ruled by fucking kings and queens. Sure, some European countries had parliaments, but they still had to go and, they still had to deal with hereditary rulers. And it's the fact that we have left that behind, yet we still treat our foreign policy in very similar ways. We've gotten rid of that aristocratic approach in our governments, domestically. Sure, we've still got oligarchies and this, that, and the other thing, but this idea that you are born into a place and that is the place where you live has faded to an incredible extent worldwide. Yet all of our conduct of foreign policy is still rooted in these infantile, thuggish prestige and questions long past there's any economic basis for it. 21st century wealth has almost nothing to do with taking territory, having more land than the other guy. Yet things are still organized in that way, and there's a tremendous potential to grow beyond that. I think the main problem is that I see Trump squandering some of that potential, and not just Trump. Bush and Obama both as well. Clinton as well. I think the last time we had an adult in the White House was George H.W. Bush, and I think he was more of an adult because it was easier back then, because you had this dual this dual thing. You know, our foreign policy establishment at least had a goal it was working towards, instead of running around rudderless as they have for the past 25, 30 years. Yeah.
I got a couple other ones here. How do you talk to anti-Semites? Particularly relevant in our chat. And will Trump get us into war with Iran? I think one of those is more in our wheelhouse.
I think they're both useful. You got an anti-Semite answer? Or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so really, the short, quick answer is you can't talk to anti-Semites because their belief is based on non-evidence. You know, the same way that you can't convince anybody that Kennedy was really killed by Oswald. You know. But one thing that you can do to maybe sway some people, especially all the people that seem to now be on the fence, or that maybe were always on the fence and now they're openly on the fence because of the Trump presidency, is that you can get yourself educated about where anti-Semitism comes from. For whatever reason, while I was in college, even though ostensibly I was studying Cuba, I ended up taking a ton of classes on the rise of fascism in Europe. It's pretty interesting the way that traditional prejudices, which were based on sort of facts, became the modern version of anti-Semitism. So you look at, like, for example, the fact that in medieval Europe, Christians couldn't lend money to Christians because usury was a sin and outlawed by the Pope. So each Christian monarch in Europe had to maintain a separate sort of non-citizen community of Jewish merchants to keep liquidity in the economy. And that's where we get this idea of, like, the Jewish moneylender. And it's not something that Jews are born into. It was this particular political situation that existed in Europe at the time. And because of that situation, you get Jewish banking families that grow up with the birth of commerce. So you get the Rothschilds, who become incredibly rich, and they end up as part of the aristocracy in every monarchical country in Europe. And, you know, this story goes on for like another 10 hours. But there's ways in which these facts, prejudices, and then especially scientific racism coming in at the end of the 1800s becomes modern anti-Semitism. And I think, you know, talking to people, especially on the fence, if you can talk about the history of where all this stuff comes from and explain in an educated way why the Chronicles of the Elders of Zion was written as a hoax by the Russian secret police, you know, maybe you could convince somebody, and at the very least, it'll make you seem smart.
Yeah, the history of anti-Semitism is extraordinary. Still today, in my fucking comments, people will surface the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, like the most comprehensively debunked text in history, but there's still people banging on about it in my comments. The persistence of these sort of anti-Semitic libels is extraordinary. I'd like to take so yes, you know, for people who are actually advancing theories about the Rothschilds or this, that, and the other thing, it's just showing the world to them and illustrating that they believe things that are not true is a difficult thing to do, but it's something we have to keep doing. But actually, to look at another side of this, I would also caution, not everybody you think is anti-Semitic is anti-Semitic. If you're calling someone an anti-Semite based on their views of Israel, then you could be making a terrible mistake. Because you don't want to conflate those two issues. I'm tremendously conflicted on Israel. I'm not entirely sure where I come down on that issue. But if somebody is complaining about the plight of the Palestinians, they are not an anti-Semite. And I think there's a lot of people in U.S. public life who like to conflate the two. I mean, anti-Semitism is a horrific, horrific thing that has brought about the deaths of millions of people. And I think actually the public speakers who try to make it seem like if you don't support Israel, you're part of this ideology are very, very problematic because people are allowed to have opinions on the actions of a country without being accused of being part of one of the most horrific ideologies in human history. So I think that's all I've got to say on that. Any good? What was the other one that you liked?
Will Trump get us into a war with North Korea?
Was it North Korea or Iran?
Sorry, yeah, Iran. But apparently he's already planning for the war with North Korea, so maybe the Iran question is a little more interesting.
Yeah, this is something I think about all the goddamn time, and I don't know. I think I actually answered this at some length in the last Sala video. I've actually seen some sort of promising things. I think over the past year, Saudi Arabia has given the Trump administration two great excuses to go to a war with Iran, and it hasn't. So I just don't know. I really hope not. I think a war with Iran would most probably not involve an invasion of Iran. It would involve some kind of conflict between U.S. and proxies and Iran and proxies in Iraq and Syria. And God knows those countries don't need any more of that shit. So yeah, I don't want to pretend to be confident about that. I'm getting slightly more optimistic that we might avoid it, mostly because Trump lacks the capacity that Bush and the Iraq War people had, but that doesn't mean we're safe at all. There were points earlier on where I thought that a war with Iran or some kind of military conflict with Iran in the Trump administration was an inevitability. I no longer think it's an inevitability, but it's still a distinct possibility.
So I think despite how craven and feckless Republicans in Congress have been on every issue from healthcare to the FBI investigation to the recent tax plan, I think that even that Congress wouldn't tolerate an actual war with Iran. Even Republicans' perennial propensity for proposing a war with Iran.
Yeah.
Now, Donald Trump launching a cruise missile or doing something of that nature where he has full power, 50-50 at best, I think, or worst, whatever your preferred adjective. What does... So when Steve Bannon was still in the government, I mean, he's still saying stuff now, but now no one's obligated to pay attention to him. When Steve Bannon was in the government, he was a proponent of this kind of war between the Christian West and the Muslim East, civilizations conflict. And he talked a few times explicitly before he was in the government about finding ways to provoke that kind of conflict. And when I got the news about us acknowledging that the capital of Israel was going to be Jerusalem, it seemed to me to be a move in exactly that direction. An attempt to provoke some sort of attack on the United States. Because, and I've said this to my parents a couple of times, that I think everybody in the Trump White House is like praying for a 9/11. They're praying for some sort of attack that's going to rally the country around the president, and the move to Jerusalem seems like an attempt to provoke, Yeah, so I don't expect an actual war with Iran, but needling them to see if we can get something out of it. Yeah, I could see that.
And that's a very good point. That if there is another large attack of some sort, then all bets are off. And yes, it becomes much more likely that something like this would happen. I don't think that the Trump administration quite reckoned with how much anger there would be against this move internationally. In the U.S., it's already faded out of the news cycle. But man, nobody in Europe is happy about this. Obviously nobody in the Middle East is happy about this. They may be succeeding in creating a unified front such that, traditional state actors who are interested in terrorism or even Al-Qaeda has got to be like, this fucking clown is doing his job, doing the job for us. I don't know that they're going to succeed in creating that terrorist attack that you're right, they absolutely want. And also, it's this gets back to another one of my bugbears. I mean, in the context of a lower oil price, there's just a lot less money swimming around for sort of planned terrorist attempts. It's getting more and more pitiful the way that Trump latches on to every loser who drives his car into a crowd as if it's, you know, I don't know, the second coming of jihad or something, when it's really just some sad loser driving his car into a crowd. So yeah, I don't know, cautiously optimistic on this question.
All right, you've been watching the chat. Anything else you wanna?
Well, so what do you think? Bruno Savagnat asks, what do you think are the answers to the problems caused by neoliberal policies, dramatic inequalities, global warming, and the rise of insecurities and a technocratization of politics? That's a lot to lay at the feet of neoliberal policies. Those should all sort of be dealt with differently, I think. Why don't we just cover on the, rather than stretch this out to 3 hours, why don't we just talk about dramatic inequalities? So what do you think the answer to the problem to dramatic inequality is, John?
Well, you know, I mean, I think in a certain sense, a rising tide lifts all boats. I think certainly neoliberal politics, as promulgated through the world by the United States over the last half century, has done a lot to provoke problems of inequality. Especially if you look at a place like Chile, which before the coup in the early 1970s was a thoroughly middle class, up and coming little country, and we managed to turn it into one of the least equal ones in the world. I mean, the other answer there is inequality runs in cycles, and as long as the world's going on, eventually the world will be more equal, and then it will be less equal, and then later it will be more equal again. But I mean, if you want my full take, the real answer to that entire question is that there may be solutions that I think are just as a necessity or by the nature of human nature are going to be cyclical. But because of the impending the impending climate catastrophe that I pretty firmly believe is coming, I think there is no solution. I think everything's going to keep getting worse.
We're all going to die.
Maybe, and then maybe all the Silicon Valley guys who are getting really into prepping, like they're going to populate the new horrible post-apocalyptic world. I got no hope. Bruno, my answer is I have no hope. None.
And I have plenty of hope. I think the world is getting better every day. I think we will successfully avoid the climate apocalypse, as we've avoided the population apocalypse, the acid rain apocalypse, the DDT apocalypse, every apocalypse we've avoided. Not that I'm saying it's not something to focus on, but I think people are doing the work that is necessary. Inequality is something. I think that I might come off a little more lefty than John here. This seems shocking, but he had mentioned that inequality goes in cycles. It tends to, but it's not a self-correcting thing. I think there will be. I think we are certainly going to get some government intervention that, as we did in the progressive era and in the New Deal, that functions to, and also, of course, the Great Depression had a lot to do with reducing inequality. So some of these things are cyclical, but I do think we're going to see a lot of government intervention, even in the United States. I would consider myself a bit of a neoliberal. I do think that these policies have done a lot of good in the world, but I also concede that they've caused real problems. And I think there will be some larger government intervention. I know a lot of people who are not enthusiastic Trump supporters, but are sort of anti-Trump. Well, at least he's getting things done, and this tax cut's going to be useful, this sort of thing. And what none of them are capable of seeing on their side of the partisan divide is that this Trump administration has made it much, and the sort of demolishing of norms that we've seen has made it much easier for a left-wing successor to do all kinds of, I suppose, what I would call damage from a neoliberal perspective, or perhaps create necessary reforms. I don't know. But, it's not going to be President Sanders, but President Kanye or what have you is going to have a much freer hand with redistribution and whatnot. when all of these, when Trump and the Republicans' time in Congress is done, because of Trump's demolishing of norms, which I think is something that not enough people have mentioned.
And I mean, if anyone's actually really interested, Bruno, for example, or not your business, there's a book by Rob's favorite author, Naomi Klein. I want that on the record. Favorite author.
Not mine.
And in her second to last book is called "This Changes Everything," and she lays out an alternate model for the modern world in which we radically change our ideas about sort of the space of our lives. That is that, you know, we're going to have to think about living locally and making stuff for the people we know, and kind of shrinking our worlds. And that might be the only way to really head off a climate disaster. It sounds parochial and sad, and we can't get into all of it right here. But if anybody's interested, go ahead and read the book. And if that's too much, you can just look up this one chapter. It's a pretty beautiful way to live. And I got a little bit of that in Mexico. So if there's one hope, it's that. And I think it's unlikely. And I think things are going to get worse until they're over.
I am an optimist. I think we'll be fine. Okay, so Orwa Barakat has asked this question over and over, and let's see if we can do this briefly. Do you believe in U.S. democracy when bribing politicians is legal? Not to mention the Electoral College, where red states have more voting power, also with the monopoly of two parties. I do. John?
Well, I don't know in what sense we're talking about believing in U.S. democracy. All governments are corrupt. It is a scale from not at all corrupt, which is non-existent, to functionally, where the corruption has destroyed any function of government, which is like Mexico is like, you know, an inch away from that side of the spectrum. The U.S. Is in a place like it was at the turn of the last century, where the wealthy have co-opted almost all political power. And historical institutions of government, like the Electoral College that he's talking about, the Senate, and the fixed apportionment of representatives in the House that we fixed in 1913. All of those serve to skew power towards the wealthy and the poor rural people and the uneducated, who for some reason really love voting for the wealthy. So my answer on this is pretty much the same as my answer on the last question, which is we'll get through this political moment. You know, the country might change in some way. There's a possibility, and I talked about it in my show on corruption a couple of months ago, that, you know, if we get to the point where Mexico's at, Mexico needs a revolution to change. I'm not saying it's going to get one, but normal politics no longer has the ability to change the Mexican situation.
Really?
Oh no, they're so far beyond it. And the U.S. could get there, you know, if we kept doing exactly what we're doing for another 50 years, we could get to the point where literally no one in the country has any faith in the political system at all.
Oh.
I think that's unlikely. I think it'll probably swing around the same way it did last century. But for the same reason as the last question, I think that we're staring down two barrels of climate apocalypse, and I'm not sure we have the time to spend on fixing our politics before we fix the other stuff we got to fix. So I am on that question.
I am an optimist.
Sorry. Yeah. The last thing is, the reason I say we're not where Mexico is because democracy still works for a certain value of democracy in the United States. Mm-hmm. Votes still get counted.
I believe that, I don't know, this is one of my bugbears that I may do a series on and lose half my audience with at some point. But that bribing politicians is legal. You know, it's not actually technically legal to bribe politicians, but it is undeniable that rich people run politics. And what I dispute is that it's ever really been different anywhere else or in any other time period. People can talk about the progressive era and the reforms that were made then. And yes, but those reforms were made by rich people who wanted to make sure that the system that they were living under still had some buy-in and didn't create that complete falling apart situation. So this idea that politicians are ever going to act outside of the interests of the people that pay their salaries through tax receipts. I don't know. I don't buy it. I think what we need is a broader sense of what those interests are, and a better sense of patriotism and compassion for the rest of the people in the country and the world from rich people. But the idea that there was some better time where rich folks weren't running things, and it's not something that I really buy. The Electoral College is, I don't know, I go back and forth. I'm a pretty big supporter of the Constitution and stuff that was always in there, but man, was not happy with the last result. That's for fucking sure. Kind of have a sense that might correct itself. I think Texas is on the cusp of going blue, and if Trump fucks up NAFTA, it'll be blue forever. I don't know. The Electoral College may once again be something we don't talk about for another 50 years, but who knows? So I'm an optimistic. I got a couple straight. It's true. I am philosophically opposed to liberal concepts like compassion. Undeniable. Let's see. On what points do you disagree with Naomi Klein? I am embarrassed to admit, from my knee-jerk dismissal of her, is that I have only listened to a couple interviews. I have not read her book, but my objection to Naomi Klein largely comes from the shock doctrine thesis, this idea that there are malicious folks running around hoping for places to fail so they can put in their sort of set of ideas. I don't know, I guess there's a scrap of truth to that, but I think it was sort of the malice that she implied there that I sort of disagreed with. That there's any philosophy or approach to politics that assumes that there's anything deeper going on than greed and short-sightedness kind of pisses me off. This idea that there's an Illuminati or a new world order or this, that, the other thing. It's like, no, there are Republicans in power who want less taxes for themselves and their donors. It's all fairly straightforward. This idea that there's a doctrine or a specific approach, or that the Trilateral Commission or Goldman Sachs, they're figuring out exactly how to like fuck you better. Okay, wait, that doesn't sound right. But I don't really put any stock in that, and that was sort of the impression that I got from a few interviews with Naomi Klein around the time that Shock Doctrine came out, and I've since avoided her work, which is perhaps unfair, but there's only so many hours in the day, and not a lot to read.
And I think that's fair enough. I think maybe there was a little bit too much intention implied in the stuff that's going on in the Shock Doctrine, and I think part of that was sort of dramatic artifice for the book. But I think you can say pretty indisputably that what we've done is set up a system that encourages when stuff happens, like the Soviet government collapses or Pinochet gets elected. And that stuff that happens is sometimes the intentional result of actions on the part of, the CIA, whoever else. But we've set up a system that all on its own exploits those situations over and over again in a specific way. But it doesn't have to be intentional. Capitalism is like pretty good at what it does.
Right.
And nobody has to be running the show for it to do that.
Well, I definitely believe in dumb incentives for systems, and then they just continuing in perpetuity. The amount of stuff that just happens outside of actual human planning, I don't think people fully appreciate that now at this point. I mean, we're already kind of living in under the rule of the robots, but the robots are all in contracts. They're all in paper form at this point, but they're still out there.
Yeah. All right, so we're at a minute or 2 hours 20.
Oh gosh, yeah, okay. So, oh god, Robert Brown. I don't even have the energy.
No. I mean, I think like pick one and let's wrap it up. Right?
Any last questions? We're biased towards large geopolitical ones. Oh God. Robert Brown, the people are no longer coming from Mexico in large numbers. And no, nobody admitted Mexico was the Wild West. It's a system that has problems. And yes, Trump's wall is a terrible idea. It's built to solve a problem that no longer exists. I've got a video on the topic. It's called "Why Donald Trump's Wall is Stupid." You should watch it. Thoughts on the future of Libya? Oof. I tend to read a bunch of news alerts and follow up on stuff in certain countries, and Libya is one where I just haven't done enough of that. Libya is a mess. I don't know. Is Haidar still the big player? I'm not on top of that. John?
I'm more like a Latin American guy. I got no idea.
Libya is a mess, and the thing about Libya is, I think that if anybody frickin' paid attention to it with any seriousness, it would be resolved fairly quickly. It is a tiny place with like maybe 2 or 3 million people, and it's absurd that we've got apparently, every country. I mean, this is actually a great example of like what a truly multipolar world could look like. Is every faction in this multi-level proxy war in Libya, civil war in Libya, is supported by 2 or 3 different elements or coalitions of countries. And the UAE has some people, and then Turkey has some people, and then, or maybe Turkey supports this other group the next week, and the US is like kind of about this and kind of about that. If everyone just sort of sat down and was like, let's pick a winner, let's frickin' end it, it'd be done. But there's nobody in the Middle East, or actually even in the US anymore, that has an interest in all that oil capacity coming back on stream. So it continues to not happen, which is very sad.
Rob,
sorry?
Rob, take a look at the chat for a second. Just to remind everybody, because this is his channel, my name is Jon Coumes. I run a podcast called Safe for Democracy. It's at safefordemocracy.com. We talk about the failures of U.S. foreign policy. Please go listen to it.
I would recommend that very highly. And actually, I think we're closing in on 2.5 hours, and I've got somewhere to be at 3. So we should probably call it a day. Did you have more sort of pitch matter you wanted to get out there, John?
We also run short shows the same way that Dan Carlin has his history shows, and then he has Common Sense. And those are all over the place, but it's all kind of the same political bent. The thing we got coming out next Monday is going to be about the way capitalism tends to create populations that are so oppressible that governments that run them never actually need to oppress them militarily. So we're going to be talking about food, the history of bread, and then building that out into sort of the same thing we were just talking about, capitalist control of societies without having a cabal or an Illuminati having to run the show. So that's a short show. And then the next set of long shows is going to be Vietnam. And I'm going to kick the shit right out of Ken Burns' documentary, which I thought was like not great.
Well, I am Robert Morris. I run. Oh, sorry. You still talking? Apparently not. I am Robert Morris. I run a channel called the More Freedom Foundation. We focus on a number of geopolitical issues. Lately, this year, I've fallen dangerously close to becoming the Saudi Arabia channel. I've got a number of videos up on that country's relationship with the United States, following under the rubric of a longer series called Everybody's Lying About Islam. I also have an essay on sale on Amazon. You can find numerous links to that throughout my online empire. I think that's really, really useful if you want to understand what is actually going on in the Middle East and what's been going on for the past 30 years. The U.S.-Saudi relationship is incredibly central to that, to Islam, to terrorism, to Islamophobia. And there's a whole bunch of publicly available information that nobody actually draws together. And I think my essay, Everybody's Lying About Islam, does that. It's available for the Kindle, and it's also available in paperback form. It's an excellent gift for this diminishing holiday season. I'd suggest you give it a look. Coming up this week, I think I'm going to be doing some videos specifically on the history of Islam, or rather the YouTube commenters' version of the history of Islam, and providing some context to things like the Muslim conquest of North Africa and the Middle East, and some, hopefully, I haven't quite written them yet, I don't know if it'll happen this week or next week, but getting into the fall of the Byzantine Empire and perhaps the fall of Al-Andalus. So yeah, I get getting to do some real history nerdery. Coming up, I have a larger series, hopefully, on comparing the U.S. empire to the British Empire, and how the fall of the British Empire teaches the United States lessons that nobody is paying attention to. I am on Instagram at The Golden Age, Twitter at RobboLaw, and really inconsistent branding everywhere. You can go to my website, www.morefreedomfoundation.com, or subscribe to this very YouTube channel for more content like this. I think I've pitched everything. John?
Yeah, that's, I mean, I don't have anything else. I might be producing some Vietnam videos shortly, which Rob and I are still figuring out, but they might end up in his channel.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that's all I got.
No, and both of us have Patreons. Patreon recently is very responsive crowdfunding site. It recently tried to initiate a bunch of changes that were very bad for patrons, and the outcry was such that they decided not to do it. Imagine that, a modern Silicon Valley website that actually responds to its users. It's exciting stuff. It is basically an ongoing Kickstarter. It's basically most of my income at this point is through Patreon, and I'm tremendously grateful to the folks who chip in there. Both John and I run separate Patreons. I'm afraid that your donations to our channels are not tax deductible, but as you consider your holiday giving plans, it might be nice to think of us, because I think, provide better coverage of these issues than pretty much anything else in the U.S. scene. I say so humbly. And with that, I think that's everything I've got. John, you got anything else?
No. I hope everybody has a good holiday weekend. I support the war on Christmas, so I won't mention any holiday in particular. But I hope people have a good time. I'll have show it on Monday anyway. Thanks for showing up.
Yeah, I don't give a shit one way or the other. Merry Christmas. I'll be seeing a movie and eating Chinese food. But Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Kwanzaa, season's greetings. And thanks so much for paying attention. We appreciate it. Thanks so much. And with that, I will close this down.